over 30 years, Mount Sinai has presented an annual Richman Lecture, endowed by Dr. Charlotte Udell, widow of the late Dr. Richman, and carried forward by his daughters, Dr. Janice Suffren and Dr. Beverly Richman. We are thrilled that we will be joined by pioneer journalist Bill Moyers this evening.
It was almost 20 years ago that I set out to produce and report a series on death and dying, which my wife suggested we should call On Our Own Terms. And then in the late 90s, my own mother's death weighed on my mind considerably. I was in her room when she stopped aging and began to die. Her forehead grew stiff, her eyes grew blank, her hands curled into claws, and she was that way for the next 3 years. And during that period of time, I was reminded day and day I had no preparation for this. Neither did the doctors in New Jersey, who were doing their very best to help my mother. She could not speak, she could not respond, there was nothing she could do. We knew she was still alive, but was she alive and was she in pain? We didn't know. And that experience was the last experience that convinced me to do this series on death and dying. And I am so grateful I did. I feel much more prepared for my own end, in no small part because I met Dr. Meier, and I'm hanging around because I expect her to take care of me when the time comes. No, I'm very serious about this. She was the first person that my research team came to see when we set out to do this subject. They said, "You've got to meet her." I came over and meet her. Later on, you'll see a short interview I did with her that in the first hour of the broadcast, the 4-part series, that became sort of the template for what we did in the next 4 hours. All my experiences with her only confirmed my determination to do this series and shape the way I was doing it. She was marvelous. She is marvelous. She is a remarkable pathbreaker in this whole field of caring for the dying. But how do you, when the technology is rapidly multiplying and people's illnesses as we grow older are rapidly multiplying? We live longer, but that doesn't mean we don't live sick a lot of the time. How does medicine stay ahead of the curve in terms of what people need in these kind of experiences? Or can it? Do you have to just race to try to catch up, Dr. Osman?
Every person experiences the fear of the unknown, the fear of pain, the fear of death in their own way, individually. And I think we have to respond to that, but there's a lot of teaching that has to happen there. And one of the things that we have particularly in this country is, I think, a fear and a stigma about taking pain medication, which the opioid epidemic that Dr. Meier referred to doesn't help us with. And so when we speak to our patients who are in pain and we try to encourage them to take pain medication, we tell them, you're going to be able to stand up and walk better. You'll be less debilitated if you take the pain medication. They say, but I don't want to be hooked on those drugs. And so we have to adjust our understanding and our expertise to the patient's expectation.
Dean Muller, I've heard that deans have wands that they can wave and just make change happen. If you could wave a wand over the curriculum that you preside over, that you are partially responsible for here, what one change would you make?
It's the humanity of medicine that gets pushed to the side. So even the things that are traditionally in the curriculum and are accepted as being important parts of what students should learn, if they don't see it being practiced on the floor, forget about palliative care. If they don't see it being practiced on the floor, good patient-doctor communication skills, then they forget it because it doesn't seem like it's real in the context of the way people are practicing medicine.
The quantitative measures are that if you look at the larger hospitals in the United States, those that care for most people, more than 50 beds, that 2/3 of those now have palliative care programs. That's important not only because people have access, but from my point of view, mostly important because that's where doctors and nurses learn to practice. So that if you are a medical student or a resident and you work alongside a palliative care team in the care of your patient, that's how you learn, as David said. You learn, medicine is an apprenticeship.
Diane will tell you that some of the numbers she quoted, 2/3 of the hospitals, blah, 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 have palliative care teams. But we all know that some of those palliative care teams are 1 or 2 people who are struggling to make it in a hospital system that doesn't really value the work that they're doing. So there's a culture shift that has to happen too, and it's the same in medical school. You can put in a curriculum about palliative care, but if it's never going to be on the exam, then everyone understands that it's not valued. And if it's not something that the physician is rewarded for in terms of the time that she's investing in that conversation, then it's going to ultimately fade away because she's being rewarded for other things, like churning more patients through, or doing more procedures, or going into a subspecialty. So it's complicated, but those are the 2 elements that I think make a really big difference. It's not just the language skills, the core skills, but it's creating an environment where everyone feels like they have permission to do it, and we care about how well they do it.
As a journalist dealing in stories and individuals, I already knew when I set out to do this series that every life is a particular life. That when you come to describe human beings, generalities are generally wrong.
Right.
And when I finished the work on this series after the 2 years, I decided also that every death is a particular death. None of us die the same way.
But I think that you have to allow yourself, with patients who are in these positions, almost to fall in love a little bit with the patient and with the family, because when you do that, you allow a certain intimacy to form between you and the patient and the family.
Countertransference, right?
Countertransfer?
Countertransference, where feelings occasioned in the doctor or the clinician by something about the patient make it hard to behave professionally towards that person. So the key issue is that there's a bell curve of humans, right? And we love most of them, but we don't love all of them. But,
No, that's right.
but we are still professional. The key professional skill is to let yourself feel that feeling and acknowledge it. If you make that conscious, then it doesn't control your behavior.
And yet we shouldn't have needed the catechism to love life today. It would have been enough to think that we are humans and that death may come this evening or not. So it may. That's what I took away from this series. Thank you again for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.